A very warm welcome to everyone for joining today's webinar, Overcoming the Top 5 Risks of 2018, Strategies for the Board and Executive Leadership. My name is Daniel Dipple, and Passageways is very happy to have with us today Scott Laliberte from Protiviti and Stuart R. Levine from Stuart Levine and Associates. But before we begin today, I'd like to do a little housekeeping. After today's webinar, we will be emailing a copy of the presentation to everyone and a link to the recording of the webinar. And near the end of today's session, there will be a Q&A. So feel free to type in your questions as they come to you, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. When the webinar is complete and you're signing off, a short survey will be presented, and we'd be greatly appreciate it if you could take a minute to complete that. And now I'd like to introduce briefly Stuart. He's Chairman and CEO of Stuart Levine and Associates, a management consulting firm for governance, strategic thinking, Csuite leadership, and Chairman and CEO of EduLeader, a online digital learning company. Stuart is a board governance veteran, having served on and currently serves on many boards. He's also an ACD governance fellow, was twice awarded as a top 100 director. And he is a very accomplished author with 3 best-selling books with over 1.2 million copies sold. With that, again, thank you all for joining, and I'll get it off to Stuart.
Thanks very much, Daniel, and appreciate your kind words. And Scott, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for your time and sharing your insights with us today. Scott, as you can see from his bio on the screen, is the Managing Director of Global Information Security Practice at Protiviti, a global consulting firm with deep expertise and particular insights in technology, business process, analytics, risk, compliance, transactions, and internal audit. As well as his professional expertise, he is an author as well, and we always welcome authors in particular. Recommend you take a look at his book, Hack IT, as we all live in a world where there is great evolution and great conversation around IT and how we protect, call it, those assets. So if we go to the next slide, and I would say to all of the people that are participating today, number one, we will have 3 questions throughout the course of our conversation this afternoon, and we'll encourage you to participate that way too. We encourage people to send questions in. I know you have that capacity. And then Scott and myself will be responsive to those questions that you send in throughout our conversation. And to set, I will call it the framework for our conversation, we particularly think that the whole conversation around risk is really important. From a board perspective, we look at it from a reputational point of view. If the firm, the company does well, it enhances the reputation, but every time you're invited to sit on a board and you function as a director, you inherit and accept certain reputational risk. So understanding, I will call it analytics, the importance and the discipline around data becomes hugely important to this conversation today. And our conversation about risk is not meant to be self-righteous. Smart people really talk about risk because at the foundation of what I'll call capitalism is understanding risk and understanding how to make better decisions based on that, and how we all, in a collaborative way, come to strategy and business modeling, understanding the risks, the competitive landscape, and how we push out products and services that are more accretive to the people that we serve. So we look at risk today as an opportunity to learn, to measure our responses in the deployment of human and financial capital, and take advantage, but not cower in a corner, take advantage of the opportunities we see evolving very rapidly based on technology and I will call it global markets that are within our reach. All of these are embedded in trust and building a culture that can share information in a non-judgmental way, and we'll spend some time talking about that. So the first question that we're going to ask you to participate in is, what do you consider your number one top risk for the year 2018? First selection, rapid speed of disruptive innovations. Second, culture is resistance to change. Cybersecurity threats. Regulatory changes. Organizations' ability to identify and escalate risk issues. Scott, what do you think the response from our audience will be today?
Well, Stuart, I think it's going to vary. I'm going to say it's going to vary based on the industry that some of the folks are in, and we'll get to that after the poll. But it's hard to prioritize some of these, and many overlap and have interdependencies. So I'll be curious to see what the group says.
Yeah, I think what we hear out and about is innovation, disruptive innovation that are being driven. It will be interesting to see how people respond, because today in our mix we have people from financial services, healthcare, academic world, and so it will be interesting. And so, Daniel or Kanako, can you share with us what those responses look like? Oh, there we go. So, Scott, you see what I do, 22% disruptive innovations, culture, 20%, cyber threats, 20%, regulatory changes, 11%, and this is interesting, organizations' ability to identify and escalate risk issues. Scott, based on your experience, how do you respond to the data you're seeing in front of you?
I think it's interesting. It's a little bit different than the data that we saw in our survey, but not too much. I do see how the one that came out on top here, organizations' ability to identify and escalate the risk issues, can be a significant risk, and you tend to get that, especially when you can't necessarily identify which one is your top risk, right? Like that may be suggested that you have an inability in your organization to be able to do that, and we do see a lot of organizations struggling with that. The rapid speed of innovation, that was a top risk in our survey, and within our client base, we see that as a major concern. And those, I think, help drive the other two top risks, which were cyber threats. That as these threats are out there and new technologies are out there, how do you deal with them? And the resistance to change, right? You're not going to embrace these disruptive technologies or know how to handle them if your culture is resistant to change. So these are in line with how I thought they would be.
Pretty interesting, yeah. And I think it does all kind of sit on the culture. And do we, in our culture, have the residual trust to have open conversations and share, let's call it, not only escalating but evolving risks that change every day? So let's go to the next slide. And Scott, can you kind of take us through what you see at Protiviti as far as your analysis across industries?
Sure, thank you. And this is a snapshot from a survey that we did with jointly done with North Carolina State, where we surveyed board members and executives amongst a bunch of clients. And by industry, this gives you the snapshot by industry of the top risks that are out there. And that's why I said I thought the results may vary a bit depending on which industries we have represented. You can see the red dots represent, the most significant risks that the organization felt. The yellow dots were potential risks, and then green is less significant, which we didn't show here. But as you can see, the rapid speed of digital disruptive innovation and new technologies was viewed as either a significant or potential impact for all of the industries that were represented. And then the other top three that we're going to talk about here in the near future, the resistance to change, that affected a little bit different than the number 3 risk, which was cyber threats. You see cyber threats really high for financial services, healthcare, and consumer products. Those industries which tend to historically have a lot of what we call high-value data, right, or personally identifiable information that attackers in the past have really sought to get and sell. and the other industries of consumer products, manufacturing, distribution, and energy more on the resistance to change in the operations. What's interesting is I think those other industries also are going to start to see increased cyber threat risk, a little bit influenced by that speed of disruptive innovation. And we can talk more about it in the other slides, but as we start to introduce new innovations and technologies, they change the risk equation, because it's not just now whether you have sensitive data or not. The risks could be loss of life, disruption to be able to produce goods and services, having to have disclosures, by the new SEC laws, things of that nature that could really impact the business. So I think even this risk profile here and the survey results, we're going to see very changing and morphing over time. If you go to the next slide, I think it's interesting to take another lens here, because not only is it industry focused, but it can also be size. Smaller organizations, which tend to have less revenue, view the risks much differently than organizations greater than $10 billion, and we would expect to see that. I mean, the risk profile is much different. At the lower levels, you can mitigate some of that risk via insurance and transference and things of that nature. But again, those top risks still come out high. The rapid disruptive innovations, much more significant on the larger companies and less so at the smaller. Cyber threats, it's a little bell-shaped curve there right in the middle. And then resistance to change, interestingly enough, did not show up in the top across the boards here. So, the resistance to change was slanted much toward the bigger organizations. And that makes sense. The bigger the organization, typically the harder it is to change rapidly to emerging threats. So, take a look at that, and you can kind of see where you prioritized the top risks and how that compares to people in your peer group.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting, Scott, in your data point on resistance to change in operations, because in our experience, making sure people understand why there is a change or why there is a need to change, and if you look at your data, that seems to be significant from the, I'll call it, 100 million all the way to the $10 billion corporation. And to me, the notion of clear communication that's driven from the CEO, I think, becomes an important gating factor. Do you have any experience in that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's tone at the top is extremely important, and making the organization feel like they're empowered to embrace that change, and that they have the resources to do so. And that culture is there, that you can have that open discussion and not be afraid to raise issues, that may not be popular, but need to be handled.
And I tell you, it's really interesting to me as I look at your research, where we talk about succession challenges and ability to attract and retain talent. Right now, it looks like it's the $10 billion and north organization. I'm willing to bet, based on what we're seeing in the labor market, so to speak, employment market, that next year, if we ask the same question, that will become a red zone question for employers next year in a big-time scenario, because as the employment numbers continue to migrate in a positive direction, there are less, I will call it, people that we really want in our organization, Scott, Yeah,
I agree with that. And I think it's also in particular areas of the employment market, skill sets. For instance, in cyber, it's negative unemployment right now. So the ability to find and attract and retain the talent there is a huge risk. Same thing with other industries and other skills. Definitely.
It's really interesting. So let's go to the next. Thanks, Scott. So let's go to the next slide that talks about disruptive innovation. And I think when you talk about new technologies emerging, and you touched on it, Scott, I will call it attracting the right talent into those cyber scenarios. I think looking hard at a risk factor which comes up in our experience, which is employee turnover, as an example, and trying to understand why people are leaving, and in fact, how do you turn this disruptive innovation into a recruiting weapon? And our experience tells us that's a big issue. And so I think there's a very rapidly evolving practice now. So if you think back 2 or 3 years ago, we went from an annual review system to now a quarterly, and most current is a review system that's based on some accountability quarterly, but it's a very fluid scenario so that people, particularly Generation Z and millennials, feel some, I'll call it touch on a much more regularized scenario. And so the rapid disruption, innovation, it's not just artificial intelligence, it's the people as well. And ultimately, as our experience will tell you from Silicon Valley, the last bullet is your organization's agility to respond to expectations that are evolving so rapidly, and that becomes critical to the calculus. The next slide talks about the culture, and you spoke about that earlier. So culture we would define as behavior. You know, how do we behave? How do we work with each other? And ultimately, making sure that there are ways to share intellectual knowledge and thinking and have inclusion and to stimulate that intellectual curiosity. And so that when we talk about the ability of an organization to make adjustments in its business models, to create a culture, with incredible trust. And I think we see an emerging trend that talks about a gating factor of values that says, hey, here is what we stand for, here are our beliefs. And particularly as you go forward in an analytics point of view, that whatever the data is, it is, and that we have to rely on that information to make some pretty important business decisions. So as you start going into the market, it's not just getting, I'll call it, people in a spot, but it's ultimately making sure that we get the right people that share our beliefs and our values. And then the next slide talks about managing cyber threats. And for me, I think it does start at the top, Scott. I think that the board definitely does own the responsibility to monitor those cyber threats. And there is data that talks about, in many cases, people don't even understand that their most precious jewels, their IP and other assets of the organizations have been compromised in excess of over 140 days. And so having those type of dashboards in place that talk about managing cyber threats and being able to access trusted, I'll call it, partners that can come in and do the testing and make sure your systems are in place and do it on a regularized basis so that internally the culture understands what those threats look and feel like, and to ensure, I'll call it, the protection and the viability of an organization. And so digitization of corporate assets, 90% total value consists of IP today, and that's a big shift. And with that comes the responsibility of boards to really ask the right questions and to put in place that ERM, I'll call it, policy that gives that board access to what those threats kind of look like. And the next slide that talks about the 5 steps, and then Scott, I'll throw it back to you for a couple of comments, excuse me, is what does that enterprise risk management approach look like? And it's not just IT, but it's the entire strategic, I will call it, model and the strategic approach to the market, and building out intelligent reporting metrics that have a dashboard so that people really understand, and then it feeds up to the board what they're being held accountable for. and making sure that you understand risk mitigation. In my view, having third-party validation experts becomes hugely important, that people who are current with the conversation can participate in that cultural discussion. Scott, any point of view on the cyber discussions here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these all build on one another, to tell you the truth. That it's a balancing act. The disruptive technologies, if you don't embrace them, you run the risk of potentially being put out of business, right? Like if you look what self-driving vehicles could be doing to the trucking industry, right? Like that could completely change the way that works and potentially put a whole group of people out of work. So you have some potential resistance to change there. If you don't go after one of those, you risk being left behind. If you go too early, you risk wasting money. But then you also now have a new risk landscape that's introduced by these technologies. If you take, for instance, that self-driving vehicle one, where their greatest risk used to be, are they just getting product from A to B, or their sales list not getting divulged. Now, if they have a vehicle that is hacked or attacked and then drives into a group of people or a building and kills a whole bunch of people, you now have a new risk. Is it a cyber risk? I would say it's related cyber risk, but it now is a potential loss of life. And if you look at how that risk was rated amongst industries, I think you're going to see industries that traditionally have not thought too highly of cyber risk as a number one threat, re-looking at that because of the new risk landscape. Potential loss of life, potential loss of not being able to ship product because you have technologies now that are driving the shipping of that product and getting it to market on time. Technologies that, like medical devices, are all becoming Internet of Things, IP enabled. They're all talking on the Internet. If they are disrupted through a cyber attack, loss of life, loss of dollars. So it's imperative that the organizations really start to look and quantify that risk and understand how it's material to the business. And I think you see that with, the SEC just put out the new public company disclosure rule on cyber. And if you look at it, it really talks about making sure you understand what is material. Right? What is a material risk to the business from a cyber perspective, and having to report, when that happens. That is going to require a conversation beyond the IT department, right? Because in my experience, usually the IT folks are thinking very tactically on the specific technology risks, and not necessarily from a materiality standpoint. How does that get to a level that could be really damaging the company? What's the dollar amount that needs to happen for that quantification? So that all gets driven by a really good risk assessment that considers the business risks that are imposed by the technology, and how do you go about controlling those risks. And Stuart, to your point about go ahead.
No,
I was going to say to your point about not having the expertise. That is it's a major struggle for the boards, right? Like they're delving into these areas where many of them understand business, they understand finance, they might understand the basics of technology, but as you start to get into these real deep new technological areas and the new advanced threats that are out there, it's critical that they understand those risks. And I think bringing in the outside experts to help educate them on that, helping them to set up a framework by which they can be getting information from the IT organization of the companies, so they meaningfully can start making sense of the data. We go a lot of places where there's metrics that are put forth, but they're not really significant to drive whether or not the company is doing well or not. And getting that third party that can come in and say, hey, here are the key metrics that you really need to be thinking about, and that can tell you when you're drifting into a not good place of an organization. That is going to be critical. And then those risks and metrics need to be revisited, because within 6 months to a year, they have to be, new metrics may need to be looked at, or the calibration of those metrics will need to be adjusted for the new environment that you're operating in.
Scott, I tell you, we had a client, that had a cyber event, And afterward, I was meeting with the CIO, and I said, "So, how did your response plan? How was it activated?" And he kind of looked at me, kind of as if I was from Mars, because they didn't have a plan. So there's an important learning. And again, we don't want to be self-righteous, but embedded in the metrics and embedded in what you're laying out as a framework for evolving and continuous discussion has to be an intelligent discussion about a response plan that talks about notification to the appropriate governmental authorities, to your key stakeholders in the organization. And to me, that becomes a really important question for board people who don't have to be, I'll call it, at your level of technology expertise, but asking the right questions about what does it look like in a response? How have we, I'll call it, kicked enough tires, and what do those phishing exercises tell us? By asking those questions, sometimes you stimulate a good discussion internally with the senior leadership team. And in the case I'm talking about, shortly after the first event, there was another, and that created a wave of interest from the board, which was interesting and strenuous. So the next polling question is, do you have regular cyber reporting on the board on our conversation here, Scott? First one, we have a dedicated board member with cyber expertise. Second option, we bring in cyber experts on a regular basis. Third, we rely upon our internal IT and cyber experts. And lastly, not enough time is dedicated to education to navigate risks effectively. So, Scott, what's your point of view? What do you think how do you think people are going to respond here today?
Not to influence it. I think we're going to see a lot of people saying not enough time. I mean, the boards that I see, they're dedicating time, but they may not have the expertise. I think the other one would be they rely on internal cyber expertise. So that's my prediction, and hopefully we'll see folks starting to gravitate towards, bringing in the outside expertise to help them out.
Yeah, I think when you get into risk analysis, you really understand the need to spend more time at a board level on, I'll call it, education and understanding, because if in fact from a strategic point of view we're going to deploy capital, then we need to understand what the intelligent, prudent deployment of capital kind of looks like. So I'd kind of migrate to you. So Daniel, would you like to share some of the responses there? That was pretty interesting here. So basically 54% rely on internal IT expertise, not enough time, 38%. And so Scott, how do you respond to that?
It's kind of where I thought it would end up. I think people hopefully are starting to recognize that may not be sufficient. And, one way you can rely on your, it's that old trust but verify, right? You can rely on your internal cyber expertise, but bringing in an outside party to help validate that, set up a framework for it, certainly can help you get more value out of that internal expertise.
Yeah. I think it's such an important issue that even if you have, I'll call it a dedicated team of cyber experts internally, for me as a board member, it's always important to have a third-party independent affirmation of how well we're doing, and I'll call it an independent assessment of what the data looks like, because independent pair of eyes tend to look at data slightly differently than we would on a day-to-day basis. And so I agree with you, and I think that's an opportunity for further conversation. But it does, I'll call it, push the envelope of the culture, because some people, in my experience, will feel, well, you're not trusting us as cyber leaders. But the fact of the matter is it's evolving so rapidly. Very interesting insight into what you were talking about earlier as well, Scott. You can get very comfortable with technology today, but whether you need your Apple iPhone, the X, or not, if you're not staying current with new technology, it doesn't take too long to fall pretty far behind, because then you start to lose touch with your customers and clients as well. So let's go into the fourth risk area, regulatory and highlighted. Go ahead, Drew.
Just a quick point to make too. It's also, do you know the right questions to ask? Because that's another area that we see. It's getting some education and awareness on the questions to be asking. I think a good example is I had a board I'd worked with where, they were asking the question of, is the data encrypted? And you had a significant amount of sensitive data on individuals. And the answer from IT was yes, but the secondary question was, it ended up that data was only encrypted when it was being transmitted. It was stored in unencrypted format, and it ended up that there was a breach, right? And the data went out, and it ended up, the board was like, well, you had said it was encrypted, and the IT group was like, well, only in transmission. It wasn't that knowledge to ask the other probing question of, is it encrypted in both formats? And that ended up being a costly issue for that company.
Yeah. And I think it also points to the fact that we're all involved in boards, and there's great transmission of transactional information, Scott. And if that gets into the hands of the wrong people, it can impact on the value of the shareholders and things like this. It's a really important conversation. And again, based on the very serious consequences, for me, I always like a third-party affirmation. And you're right. What are those couple of questions that we should have? And I think it starts with, why would people attack us? And what are those values that we have that want to understand it? And what are our crown jewels? I think in our work as well with boards, asking what are our most critical data assets? And then what are we doing to protect them? And that stimulates, when people really understand the impact that it has to the core business model, it's an incredibly, I'll call it, invigorated conversation, Scott, So
Great.
We're on to the regulatory and heightened regulatory scrutiny, okay? And so here we're talking about 59% respondents rate this as a significant impact. Fact of the matter is, we started our conversation talking about reputational risk. And we all want to be in the position to be able to say, yes, we asked the right questions. Yes, we had a third party help us take a look at what the regulatory response should be. And I think it's a mistake for people to believe that based on, I'll call it, current environment in Washington, that you never have to worry about what the regulators are talking about. I personally think that's a huge error. And people that take their eye off the ball of regulatory oversight and its impact on shareholder value are making a big mistake. The next slide talks about culture and understanding what those risks look like. And you touched on something, Scott, earlier, and I want to bring you back to it on what I'll call education and what gets communicated and where and how. And I'd like you to share a little bit of your experience in that as well, the sharing and communicating of information.
Sure. Yeah, the getting what information should be shared and how it's communicated so it's in an understandable format and it's meaningful is really critical. And then making it to where, as we discussed, people are not afraid to bring up news that might not paint a rosy picture. I would argue most, cyber is my backbone, right? But most organizations are not in a great state from a cybersecurity perspective, cyber defense perspective, yet they are hesitant to bring that picture to the board, right, to many boards, because there's fear of what the retribution will be or the blowback. But we can't be afraid to acknowledge that sometimes we're not in the best of positions, because that's the only way you're going to fix it.
I think that's a strong and an honest response when you talk about fear, because I'd much rather understand up front what the risk is than have an event and then say, gee whiz, we should have had the confidence and the trust that the board, we'll call it senior leadership, to have an open and honest conversation. And that's why the communication becomes important. And I, for one, like as a board member, to see data that talks about how successful our own people are on the exercises relating to cybersecurity and how well we do as a board, as opposed to having an unfortunate event. And my experience may be different than yours, but there's a serious percentage of everybody thinks it's a foreign agent that's hacking in, but our experience will tell us that there's a large percentage of hacking and I'll call it bad behavior that's generated internally in an organization. People that, you know, they have nothing to do at 2:00 on Saturday night, and so they start cruising around websites, cracking through different firewalls, and it turns out that somebody didn't tell them they shouldn't be doing that internally in an organization, which speaks of the culture of the organization. And what happens then in the event that you have somebody who's gone off the reservations, a very important conversation. So it's that trust. And ultimately, we have to be, if you want to be a serious business leader, we have to eliminate fear as much as possible and say, hey, this is a serious risk to our enterprise, and we have to be able to have an honest conversation about that. And the next 5 highest risks, we talk about succession planning, and we touched on this lightly, but the notion of attracting people to your organization, really the people that we want today, Scott, everybody wants, and those people have options. And so making sure that the culture in the community at large, and it is a very, very small world, that the culture is recognized as being a really good place to work, and that you can feel it when you recommend your friend or a family member joining an organization. And that's an important, I'll call it, recruiting weapon that doesn't get enough conversation. And the succession challenge is making sure that those people, particularly millennials today, where we see a lot of churning, get touched by leadership, not necessarily in a 2-hour annual review process, but on a regularized basis that says, okay, look, here's what we agreed to achieve, here's how we did it, and by the way, here are the couple of things you may want to consider moving forward. And then pushing up against that, the analytics for, I'll call it, new products and services that are based on what the consumer is telling us they want in the marketplace. Scott, you want to spend a minute just sharing and responding to what I just said vis-a-vis succession challenges and technology?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you outlined the issue very well, but you know, making sure that you have those plans there, that you have the right people identified, that you've trained them, and that you have that succession plan in place. It's easy to overlook, especially when you're dealing with all these other issues, right? The technology issues and making the tough decisions. But I think you hit the nail on the head.
That's high praise from a technology guy. Hey, Scott, I'll give you an example, which is interesting, because we're involved in an organization right now where we're delivering a lot of performance training. And there is a school of thought that says, okay, you deliver the program and then we'll see you later. In talking to one of my colleagues recently, we said, you know what, every couple of weeks of those 74 people we just put through this program for that particular organization, why don't you just pop a 2 or 3 sentence note to them that says, by the way, here are the 2 or 3 principles that we discussed. Because what technology does do is give us a very cost-efficient way to share information that is very crisp, okay? And I think that way you reinforce some of the learnings and give us an opportunity to stimulate intelligent succession planning and understand the impact that goes into it. And so for me, again, as you look out into the digital world, it doesn't necessarily have to be negative. I think you have to deploy it and leverage the communication in a very consistent way from senior leadership, okay? So the next slide, please. Yep. Yeah, it's important. It's an opportunity, right, Scott? It's really an opportunity that sometimes people get so traumatized on this discussion of risk and cyber that they lose sight of the fact that there's a tremendous opportunity to build relationships, A, with us as customers, and B, as employees and working together. So 2018 versus 17, operational risk. And so let's take a look at this one together. So basically, operational risk showing the greatest increase in risk ratings. Scott, how do you relate to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you start to bleed over, right? I think operational risk is also going to be hand in hand with technology risk, and the two play together. So I think that's a big one. Looking at the cultural issues as well. I mean, it's just building upon what we had already talked about, right? So if you don't start nipping that in the bud, it's just going to continue to escalate. And when you look at the other things going on, there are big geopolitical shifts and instabilities going on right now throughout the world. There's also, when you look at or across the world, the regulatory aspect there is significant. So I think you talked earlier about, look at the current administration is not real favorable on new regulation, but other parts of the world are, right? And you look at the global data protection regulation coming out of Europe, that's coming out of Europe, but it has a huge impact on U.S. companies that either do business in Europe or have European customers and they advertise for goods or services in Europe. So you can say you're not going to have new regs in the United States, but other areas of the world, you get the China cybersecurity law, et cetera. These global regulations, given the global economy that we're in, are really going to start impacting U.S. companies as well.
And so I agree with you, and it is kind of interesting for you and myself to talk about global issues. But I think for those of us who have the privilege of, I'll call it leading in organizations, it's also our responsibility to focus. So if you're in healthcare, looking at the patient as a human being, as a member of, I'll call it our community, and building those metrics so that people can understand in our culture what it looks and feels like. And so to me, that links into the mission, and then that I think accelerates us. So let's kind of move along here. The board versus the C-suite. Board members ranked 9 out of 30 as significant impact. CFOs 3 out of the 30 as significant. So there's a little break in that scenario as well. And I think, again, good communication between the board and C-suite is really an important conversation, which brings us to poll question number 3. Is the business risk environment effectively monitored? Annually, quarterly, monthly? Monitored but not effectively, or not at all? Scott, what's your point of view here on poll question number 3?
I think we're going to see a lot of folks select annually, though I'm hoping that they're starting to realize that that's not frequent enough.
Yeah,
I really think the business risk environment is changing so rapidly these days. I think almost quarterly it's going to need to be looked at as part of board meetings and other key meetings.
I think based on the public sector and what we're accustomed to, I think it'll tilt slightly toward the quarterly, but let's see what our participants are talking about today. So, Daniel, let's put that question up there. Oh, there we go. So quarterly, 32. Wow, this is pretty tight. Annually, 32%. Quarterly, 32%. Monitored but not effectively. So basically, 64% see some regular conversation. And, so how do you respond to that annually versus quarterly, Scott?
Yeah, I think annually has been a trend of the past. A lot of organizations did that. They're going to have an annual risk assessment, or they do an annual risk process. I'm encouraged to see 32% quarterly, and I think that's a trend of where we need to go. Even if it's just reaffirming that the previous position you had is still relevant, that still needs to be a conversation, it needs to be brought up. So, I think it's a trend we should be moving towards.
Yeah, and you know what? My takeaway is, honestly, people that jump on webinars like this, Scott, tend to be people who are interested in learning. So I'm not surprised to see that quarterly data point be a little higher than it might be in call it a regularized conversation. Just,
That's
point of view.
Point.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah. It is. And I think that in truth, the notion of intellectual curiosity when we talk about culture is a real differentiator today. How do you stimulate, I'll call it intellectual curiosity and make those moves? So the next steps that we see out there, boards see riskier environment, but they may not be fully engaged with the digital revolution. And I would say that is a big time issue because for a certain generation, it's painful because it's so much to absorb. For people who are looking at the deployment of capital, they're worried about the risk of, I'll call it, burning too much capital. So, Scott, do you have a couple of fast thoughts on how that digital revolution plays out here and where we're going?
Well, I think we touched on it a lot during the webinar, but it's the digital revolution is changing the way we do business. It's changing the way you're going to engage with customers. It's changing the way the customers expect to be engaged. And it's also changing the risk landscape that you need to look at. So, that resistance to change may be prevalent in many organizations, but we've got to make sure that we aren't resistant to that change and we're considering the impact that digital would have upon the whole organization, how we can make it better, and how we manage the risks that imposes to the business.
And I'll tell you, I'm going to throw it over to Daniel for some questions from the audience, but one final thought on this point, and that is what the digital revolution continues to do is make, I'll call it, our responses as consumers, as clients, even more important. If you think about the violent nature of our relationships today, and I'm sure, Scott, you travel as much as I do. Every time you come off a plane, your preferred airline is sending you a survey to see how well you did. You're now getting it in all other products and services. And so as a board person, if you're not seeing what I'll call client satisfaction in a current format, I would say it's impossible to really define just how well your CEO and your senior leadership team is affirming the future. Because if you miss something, and if we get tone deaf, and none of us like to, I'll say, hear bad news, but if the baby's ugly, it's a heck of a lot better to hear it sooner than later and then readjust your product or your service or your delivery based on the actual data you're hearing from your marketplace. So, Daniel, I know you have some questions that have come across the transom, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask us and some thoughts that you have, questions.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Stuart. Thanks, Scott. Real quick, kind of interesting question here. What recommendations do you have for getting older board directors to start to use newer consumer or business technologies hands-on to overcome that fear that was mentioned?
Well, yeah, that's one where I think you need to get outside help, right? I mean, it's not just older board members. I think I see it all the time. I do a lot of board education. People that are the most astute business people I've ever seen. They understand accounting and finance deeper than anyone I know, but they haven't had a background in technology, and they're trying to understand these very complicated concepts, technology concepts. If you can find a person that can translate those complex technology concepts into very easy to understand language for you, make sure you grab that person and hang on to them, right? Because it's rare, it's really hard to find, but that's what you need, because we need the leadership and business acumen of those board members to make intelligent, informed decisions, but we need to be able to convey the risks and the decision points in ways that they can consume to be able to make those decisions. And board education is a big one. There's a lot. I do some stuff with the NACD on board education, and just finding that trusted advisor that can help you to understand it. That's key.
I think a couple of fast responses. I agree with what Scott just shared with you, and here's some practical applications to that. Number one, I think you have to ensure that your board, without regard to the size of your organization, distributes your board book, your board material through a secured portal like Passageways. I'm a major league supporter of that. I think the days of killing innocent trees in generating books is really yesterday. So number one, I want to make sure that occurs. Number two, I think the notion of intellectual curiosity has to be at the board level. And so if people are not willing to learn or ask questions that they're not comfortable with, then I think the Nom/Gov committee has to calculate that into the narrative for the renomination process, because the consequences are so serious today, Daniel, that if you have underperforming assets at a board level today that are not willing or able to understand the new digital world, I would say that their ability to contribute to a strategic discussion about risk and deployment of capital is limited by definition. Back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, it's excellent. I actually have a good example also of getting someone trained up. We had a board portal customer. Director was 90 years old, and he was having trouble using the platform. He actually had his 8-year-old great-grandson show him how to use an iPad. I think there's multiple avenues for getting outside help for using technology. The next question actually kind of overlaps with this one, so I think we can pass it by. I was asking for in-person or online training courses or firms that, around cybersecurity risks. And I'm sure that we could probably gather some together between yourself, Scott, and Stuart, and we probably could send that to everyone. The full report here, as you can see, it can be downloaded. It'd be great if you could take an opportunity to do that. And Conoco, if you could move to the next slide. I'd like to real quickly let Scott talk a little bit about his firm. Appreciate that.
Yeah, sure. So my firm's Protiviti. We do business risk consulting, technology risk consulting, and internal audit. I lead our cybersecurity practice globally for the firm, and I do a lot of board education. I also help a lot of companies with assessing where they stand on security and relaying that information to boards in a consumable fashion, and also do everything from assessments to implementations of security products for my clients. And a couple of books along the way there if you're interested in the contact information there if you have questions.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Scott. And Stuart, if you could say a couple of words about what Stuart Levine and Associates does, it'd be great.
So look, I think at the end of the day, it's all about strategy. It's all about culture. It's about accountability. And strategy comes from building inclusion in the organization based on as many people as you can get into that assessment, feeding into the development of strategy, building accountability models that make sense, and ensuring that leadership develops their skills so that they can build apostles in the organization and strengthen their relationships with their clients. And to me, that's very important, all focused on values and mission. And I think that's where you get to be very, I'll call it innovative today. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for Passageways and for Protiviti for participating here today, Scott. Back to you, Daniel, for the last word.
Thank you, gentlemen. And real quick, Passageways, we have our onboard next-gen board portal, and it's we say next-gen because it's third generation. It's completely cloud. It's on the Microsoft Azure platform, which means it is very secure. And so that, on the topic today, that the risks that one can have from having printed board books or emailing them, if you don't do it securely, you're putting yourself at extreme risk. So number one, you're saving trees, all the printing and shipping, and also the time that it takes to get board books to individuals, and then also all the communications that take place between directors and CEO and board administration can all be done securely within the platform. So you can start a free trial with that, as you can see there on the slide. Appreciate it. If any of you are interested, we'll be happy to set you up with that. And Scott, Stuart, it was fantastic, excellent information. And if either of you have any few parting words here, and after that, we'll sign off for the day.
I just want to thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, I think we're good to go, and thank you again, Passageways, for giving us an opportunity to share some experience and learn from each other. Thank you.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, too.
Thank you. Everyone have a good day.
Right, bye.